The Ocampa nearly annihilated the galaxy in a ruthless campaign of domination, but humanity held fast, fighting tooth and nail in a desperate war for survival. Admiral Roger Hall stood erect and rigid, gazing out at the stars from the observation deck of the TSS Indomitable. The weight of the past pressed upon his shoulders. 20 years ago, he led the decisive battle against the Ocampa, barely securing a costly peace after a brutal conflict that claimed billions of lives across 100 worlds. Hall clenched his fist as he read the urgent message from Fleet Command. Ocampa raiders struck again, destroying 3 remote human outposts along the neutral zone. 1,274 dead, civilians and soldiers alike, slaughtered without mercy. The Ocampa sovereignty declared the attacks a tragic misunderstanding, but the Terran Republic saw through their lies. Tensions simmered like a reactor on the verge of meltdown. "Admiral, long-range sensors detect inbound Ocampa warships," Lieutenant Chen called out, voice tight. 26 frigates and destroyers, and sir, they have a dreadnought with them. Hall felt his blood run cold. 1 dreadnought outgunned his entire battle group. His fleet of 6 cruisers and 14 destroyers suddenly seemed fragile and small before the looming Ocampa juggernaut. If the Ocampa broke through here, nothing stood between them and the anchorage at Ross 842. Over 350,000 civilians would be slaughtered without mercy, just like Epsilon Indy all those years ago. "We hold the line," Hall declared, his voice hard as steel. "Power up weapons, raise shields, prepare for battle." He met the eyes of every member of his bridge crew, saw his own persistence reflected back. Humanity would not fall, not on his watch. The Ocampa would pay for every drop of human blood they spilled. This he swore. As the Ocampa warships approached on the interface, Admiral Hall's mind drifted back to his first encounter with their ruthless might 20 years ago. Fresh out of the academy, Lieutenant Roger Hall had been a gunnery officer on the cruiser TSS Reliant, part of the 14th Fleet, guarding human space near the Ocampa sovereignty. He remembered the day like it was yesterday, alarms blaring as a massive Ocampa armada jumped in, led by their flagship, the dreadnought Conquest. The Ocampa launched a devastating surprise attack, hammering human colonies and slaughtering millions in a blitzkrieg assault. Hall gripped his gunnery console tight as the Reliant shuddered under enemy fire. The Ocampa's advanced weaponry and shielding overwhelmed the human fleet's defenses. He could only watch in horror as the Reliant's sister ships were torn apart by withering salvos, hulls splintering and venting atmosphere. "Lieutenant, focus fire on Grid 7, Captain Shu barked. Hall targeted the batteries, blasting away at the approaching Ocampa destroyers, but it wasn't enough. A wing of Ocampa frigates strafed the Reliant, breaching her armor. Explosions rocked the bridge, bulkheads buckled, consoles sparked and smoked. "Hull breach decks 4 through 9, someone shouted. "We're venting air." Hall glanced over to see Captain Shu and Commander Patel sprawled on the deck, dead or unconscious, blood pooling around them. Dread knotted his gut, but he shoved it down. No time for fear now. "Seal off those sections," Hall ordered, assuming command. He hailed the other battered human ships. "This is Lieutenant Hall on the Reliant. Form up on me. We need to punch a hole through their lines and target the dreadnought's engines." Weaving and rolling, the tattered human flotilla slipped past the screen of enemy destroyers, Hall's quick thinking and clever maneuvers barely keeping them intact. The Conquest loomed ahead, its vast hull dripping with weapons. Hall narrowed his eyes, spotting a flicker in the dreadnought's aft shields as it fired. "There! All ships, focus fire on this quadrant now." Barrages of torpedoes and particle beams slammed into the weakened shielding. The barrier crumpled. Hall lined up the shot himself, hands flying over the controls. "Firing!" A volley of quantum torpedoes leapt from the Reliant's forward tubes. Hall's expert gunnery on full display. The projectiles knifed through the gap in the shields and struck the Conquest's engines. Gouts of plasma burst from the mighty warship's rear. Secondary explosions rippled across its hull. The Ocampa fleet, their flagship crippled and formation crumbling, began a fighting retreat. Hall sagged back in his chair, uniform drenched in sweat, as a ragged cheer went up. They had held the line, if only just. But the cost? In the aftermath, the Terran Republic hailed Hall as a hero for his valor. Awarding him the Galactic Cross, he was promoted straight to captain, but even as the celebrations echoed through human space, Hall couldn't forget the ruthless brutality of the Ocampa, the cold mercilessness in their assault, the utter lack of regard for human life. Never again, he swore to himself. Never again. Admiral Hall snapped back to the present, as the shrill beep of the tactical console pierced his concentration. Lieutenant Chen's fingers flew over the controls. "Sir, the Ocampa fleet has launched a spread of missiles, bearing 175 Mark 20, range 50,000 kilometers and closing fast." Hall reacted instantly. "Evasive pattern Delta 5. Bring point defense systems online and prepare countermeasures." The human ships, sleek and agile compared to the bulky Ocampa vessels, pivoted and accelerated, thrusters flaring. Swarms of defensive turrets swiveled and spat streams of tungsten rounds, filling space with crisscrossing tracers. Scores of missiles vanished in puffs of shrapnel and fire as the human gunners found their marks. But the Ocampa launched well. Too well. A dozen missiles slipped through the valiant defense, lancing toward the human formation. Point-blank range now, no time to evade. Two destroyers, the Valor and the Intrepid, vanished in blossoming fireballs as the missiles punched through their shields and detonated inside their hulls. Debris and molten metal spun lazily through the void. Hall felt each loss like a knife to the gut, but he shoved the pain aside, gritted his teeth, focused on the battle. "All ships, assume formation Lambda 3, tighten up and overlap your defensive fire." The human ships coalesced into a wedge, their combined point defense cannons weaving a lethal web of projectiles. On Hall's command, the battle group leapt forward, closing the distance to energy weapon range. Torpedoes and particle beams crisscrossed space as the two fleets pounded each other. Hall watched the plot, eyes hard. Getting closer now. Their beam cannons would be the equalizer, able to carve through the Ocampa shields like a scalpel. Almost there. The dreadnought opened up, its gargantuan spinal railguns hurling 100-ton slugs at relativistic velocities. The Indomitable shuddered as one of the hypersonic rounds grazed her shields, the transferred momentum bleeding through and sending lightning arcing across the hull. Damage alarms wailed. "Damage control report," Hall barked. "Shields holding at 40%. Power surges on deck 7 and 10. Repair crews en route." Hall saw his chance, an opening in the Ocampa formation. A gamble, but one he had to take. "Helm, bring us about, bearing 090 Mark 015, flanking speed. Maelstrom Tornado, form up on us. We're going to take a bite out of that dreadnought." The Indomitable and her two escorting destroyers peeled away, charging straight at the Conquest, weapons blazing. Hall clenched the armrests of his command chair as the massive warship swelled in the view screen, guns hammering, a bold move, bordering on reckless, pulling the beast's attention, buying time for the rest of the fleet to whittle down the Ocampa escorts. The dreadnought's point defense guns swiveled to meet the threat, filling space with a hurricane of fire. The Indomitable's shields flared and crackled as they strained to deflect the onslaught. But Hall didn't flinch, even as the bridge shook around him. He had a plan. A desperate one, but their only shot at evening the odds. Overseer Fornax stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, the subjugator, as it traded fire with the battered human fleet. The Ocampa commander narrowed his eyes as he watched the Terran cruiser and its two escorts break formation and charge his ship. Bold, but foolish, just like the humans. Fornax had waged war across the stars for decades, crushing countless alien races beneath the Ocampa's iron heel. But these humans, they were different. They refused to break, refused to bend the knee, no matter how many of their worlds burned. They fought with a tenacity and courage that almost made Fornax respect them. Almost. 20 years ago, when word reached him of the Conquest's defeat at human hands, Fornax had been shocked, outraged. The mighty Ocampa, beaten by primitives from the galactic rim. Unthinkable. It was a humiliation that could not stand. Now, with the subjugator under his command and a crew hungry for blood, Fornax would remind the humans of their place in the cosmic order, beneath the boot of the Ocampa. "Concentrate all fire on the lead cruiser's engines," Fornax ordered, his voice cold. "I want them crippled." The dreadnought shuddered as it unleashed the full fury of its spinal cannons and broadside batteries. Fornax allowed himself a small smile as he saw the human ship's shields flare and fail under the onslaught. On the Indomitable's bridge, Admiral Hall gripped the arms of his command chair as his ship bucked and heaved. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks, and crewmen were thrown to the deck by the impacts. "Shields down to 20%, Lieutenant Chen shouted over the chaos. "We can't take much more of this." Hall opened his mouth to reply, but his words were lost as a massive explosion rocked the cruiser. He was hurled from his chair, his head cracking against a bulkhead. Stars burst across his vision. Groaning, Hall dragged himself upright, blood trickling into his eyes from a gash on his forehead. He blinked, trying to clear his sight, and felt his stomach drop. Through the viewscreen, he saw one of the Indomitable's 3 main drives burning. Plasma venting from the ruined engine. The cruiser was listing badly, careening off course. "Damage report," Hall barked, staggering back to his chair. "Port drive is gone, sir," Chen replied, her face pale. "We're down to maneuvering thrusters only." Hall cursed under his breath. With its main engine destroyed, the Indomitable was a sitting duck. The Ocampa dreadnought loomed on the console, its guns still hammering away. Suddenly, the Maelstrom and Tornado, the Indomitable's 2 escorting destroyers, surged forward. Their captains had seen the cruiser's plight and were moving to intercept the dreadnought, trying to draw its fire. Hall watched in helpless horror as the destroyers charged the subjugator, their hulls blazing with the light of their own weapons. It was a brave move, but a futile one. The dreadnought barely seemed to notice the smaller ships. It swatted them aside contemptuously, its massive guns shredding their shields and armor smoothly. In moments, both destroyers were gone, reduced to clouds of molten debris and glittering fragments. Hall slumped in his chair, grief and rage warring in his heart. His ship was crippled, his escorts destroyed. The battle, it seemed, was lost. But as he stared at the looming bulk of the Ocampa dreadnought, Hall's eyes hardened. No, he refused to let it end like this. The Indomitable still had one card left to play. "Weapons," he called out. "Prepare a full spread of the dark energy torpedoes, maximum yield." A murmur of surprise ran through the bridge. The DETs were experimental, unstable. They had never been fired in anger before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Aye, sir," the weapons officer replied, fingers flying over his console. "Torpedoes armed and ready, targeting the enemy dreadnought." Hall nodded grimly. This was it, their last chance. Fire. The Indomitable's torpedo tubes throbbed with power as the dark energy warheads loaded into place. In the gunnery control room, tense crewmen ran final checks, hands flying over consoles slick with nervous sweat. They all knew the stakes, the risk they were taking. The debts were banned for good reason. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they could rip a hole in the universe itself. But what choice did they have? The battle was lost. The Ocampa were too strong. It was this or death for all of them, and for the hundreds of thousands of civilians at Ross 842. On the bridge, Admiral Hall gripped the arms of his command chair, his fingers tightening. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the burden of the lives he held in his hands. But he pushed the doubts aside. He had to be strong, for his crew, for the Republic. "Torpedoes armed and ready," the weapons officer reported, his voice taut. Hall nodded grimly. "Fire." The Indomitable bucked as the torpedoes blasted from her tubes, the ship's wounded frame groaning in protest. On the viewscreen, the warheads streaked towards the Ocampa dreadnought, leaving trails of shimmering darkness in their wake. Overseer Fornax leapt to his feet as the proximity alarms blared. "Hard to port," he roared. Activate point defense batteries. The dreadnought shuddered as its thrusters fired, the massive ship lumbering into a turn. Its guns swiveled and spat streams of tungsten rounds, filling space with a deadly lattice of fire. Several torpedoes vanished in puffs of dark matter as the dreadnought's guns found their mark, but more kept coming, an inexorable tide of destruction. The point defense cannons couldn't track them all. 3 warheads slipped through the barrage and detonated against the dreadnought's hull. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then reality screamed. The torpedoes' dark energy cores collapsed into microscopic black holes, gravity wells so intense they devoured light itself. The dreadnought's armor crumpled like foil as the singularities consumed it, ripping through decks and bulkheads, crushing crew into paste. Fornax howled in rage and terror as the bridge caved in around him, consoles sparking, bodies twisting. He felt the impossible weight of the singularities pulling at him, stretching him, flaying him atom by atom. Then, in a flash of blinding, hawking radiation, the black holes evaporated, their lifespan spent. The dreadnought, once a mighty titan of the void, was nothing more than a twisted skeleton of metal, its structure warped beyond recognition by forces beyond comprehension. On the Indomitable's bridge, a cheer went up as the dreadnought's icon vanished from the tactical display. Against all odds they had done it. They had brought down the beast. But Admiral Hall felt no elation, only a grim satisfaction and a bone-deep weariness. The battle wasn't over yet. "All ships, press the attack," he ordered, his voice hard. "Let's finish this." The human fleet surged forward, beam cannons and railguns hammering at the reeling Ocampa ships. Caught off guard by the sudden destruction of their flagship, the alien vessels scattered and broke, their formation disintegrating. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The Indomitable's guns tore through the enemy ships unopposed, leaving nothing but drifting wreckage and frozen corpses. The Ocampa fought back desperately, but without coordination, without leadership, they stood no chance. In a matter of minutes it was over. The once proud Ocampa armada was reduced to a graveyard of shattered hulls and cooling plasma, a monument to the folly of their aggression. Admiral Hall slumped in his chair, exhaustion hitting him like a hammer. They had won, yes, but the cost... He looked around his ruined bridge at the shaken, soot-stained faces of his crew. How many of them had he lost today? How many more would he lose before this war was over? And the DETs, Hall shuddered. He had unleashed a monster, a weapon that defied the very laws of physics. What would be the consequences, not just for him, but for the Republic, for the galaxy? In the aftermath of the battle, Admiral Hall stood on the Indomitable's scorched bridge, surveying the damage reports scrolling across the cracked screens. The once proud cruiser limped through space, her hull pockmarked with scars and her engines sputtering. 3 destroyers, the Maelstrom, Tornado and Valkyrie Swayers, were gone, reduced to expanding fields of debris and frozen corpses. The rest of the fleet hadn't fared much better, with several ships reporting critical damage and casualty lists that ran into the hundreds. Hall rubbed his eyes, exhaustion and grief tugging at him. The cost had been high, but they had won. They had saved the Ross 842 anchorage and its hundreds of thousands of civilians. And yet, as he watched the casualty reports scroll by, each name a life snuffed out, a family shattered, he couldn't help but wonder, at what price? His dark musings were interrupted by a commotion on the bridge. Lieutenant Chen, her face ashen, turned to him. "Admiral, we're receiving an emergency transmission from Terran Command. It's about the dark energy torpedoes, sir." Hall felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had known this moment would come, had known that the decision to use the DETs would have consequences, but he had hoped, perhaps naively, that the necessity of his actions would be understood. He was wrong. The transmission painted a grim picture. The galactic community, already wary of humanity's rapid rise to power, had reacted with outrage and horror to the news of the DET's deployment. The Galactic Council, the governing body that maintained the fragile peace between the starfaring races, had convened an emergency session to address the incident. and Admiral Hall, as the commanding officer who had made the fateful decision, was summoned to appear before them. Hall stood in the Grand Chamber of the Council's headquarters on the neutral world of Concord, facing a semicircle of representatives from a dozen species. Some, like the crystalline Vorsath or the insectoid Clix, were familiar allies of humanity. Others, like the reptilian Saurians or the enigmatic Chinrathi, regarded the Terran Republic with barely concealed hostility. The councillors took turns grilling Hall, their questions sharp and accusatory. Why had he resorted to such a devastating weapon? Did he not understand the consequences, the dangerous precedent it set? Did humanity think itself above the laws and treaties that governed the civilized galaxy? Hall answered as best he could, his voice steady despite the anger and frustration boiling within him. He spoke of the Ocampa's unprovoked aggression, of the imminent threat to Ross 842 and its innocent civilians. He reminded the Council of the Ocampa's long history of conquest and subjugation, and the countless species that had fallen beneath their ruthless advance. "Where was this council when the Ocampa burned the Vorsath homeworld?" he demanded, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Where were the sanctions and condemnations when they enslaved the Clix? The Terran Republic has stood against the Ocampa's tyranny for decades, while the rest of the galaxy turned a blind eye. And now, when we finally have a chance to end their threat once and for all, you would condemn us for doing what must be done?" But his words fell on deaf ears. The councillors, secure in their moral superiority, cared little for the realities of war. They spoke of sanctions against the Terran Republic, of stripping humanity of its council seat. Some even called for Admiral Hall to be tried for war crimes. The debate grew increasingly heated, the chamber echoing with shouts and recriminations. But just as it seemed that the council would move to censure humanity, a new development shattered the proceedings. A holographic display flared to life in the center of the chamber, the image flickering and static-laced. It showed a vast armada of Ocampa warships, far larger than the fleet Hall had just faced, tearing through space towards the heart of human territory. A grim-faced Terran admiral appeared on the screen, his uniform torn and bloody. "This is a priority alert to all Terran forces," he said, his voice crackling with interference. "Long-range sensors have detected a massive Ocampa invasion fleet headed for our core worlds. The Ross 842 attack was just a feint, a distraction to draw our forces away from the real target. The Ocampa are coming in force, and they mean to end us once and for all. All ships, rally at the following coordinates. This is not a drill, I repeat, this is not a drill." The transmission cut off, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. For a long moment no one in the council chamber moved or spoke, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Then Admiral Hall stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Councillors, I understand your concerns about the dark energy torpedoes, but right now, the Ocampa are coming to wipe humanity from the stars, and we need every weapon and every ship we have to stop them. The Terran Republic stands on the brink, and we stand alone. We will fight to our last breath to defend our homes and our people. All I ask is that you stay out of our way." With that, he turned and strode from the chamber, leaving the stunned councillors in his wake. There would be a reckoning for his actions, he knew, but that was a problem for another day. Right now, he had a war to win and a people to save. As he stepped onto the shuttle that would take him back to the Indomitable, Hall felt a new sense of purpose settle over him. The road ahead would be prolonged and difficult, and the odds were stacked against them, but humanity had faced extinction before and had always found a way to survive. They would do so again, no matter the consequences. He just hoped that, when the dust settled and the blood dried, there would still be a Terran Republic left to defend. In the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, the once accusatory voices fell silent as the grim reality of the Ocampa threat sank in. The Vorsath councillor, his crystalline form shimmering with agitation, spoke first. "The Ocampa have long been a blight upon the galaxy, but never before have they dared an assault of this scale. It seems we have no choice but to stand with the humans." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, a sea change from the earlier condemnation. The Clique's representative, her chitinous exoskeleton rattling, added her voice. The Terran Republic has shown they have the will and the means to resist the Ocampa. We would be wise to follow their lead. Even the Saurian delegate, his scales flushed with reluctance, nodded his assent. The humans have bought us time with their unorthodox tactics, time we must now use to mount a united defense. Admiral Hall stood before the council, his uniform still stained with the blood and sweat of battle. Councillors, I take no pleasure in the actions I was forced to take, but the Ocampa have made their intentions clear. They will not stop until every last one of us is ground beneath their heel. We must put aside our differences and fight, or we will surely fall. The vote was swift and unanimous. The Galactic Council pledged its full support to the Terran Republic, and Admiral Hall found himself thrust into the role of Supreme Commander of the Coalition forces. As the Indomitable limped back to the human core worlds, the tattered remnants of the Terran fleet at its side, they were greeted by a sight that lifted even the most battle-weary spirits. Ships of every conceivable design and origin filled the void, a kaleidoscope of united purpose. Sleek Vorsath cutters darted between bulbous Clix freighters and angular Kinrathi battlecruisers, while lumbering Saurian dreadnoughts drifted alongside nimble Terran destroyers. In the Indomitable's main hangar, Admiral Hall oversaw a hive of activity as engineers and technicians from a dozen species swarmed over the battle-scarred ships. Vorsath nano-welders sealed breaches in the Indomitable's hull with shimmering fields of force, while Clix drones wove webs of organic polymer to reinforce weakened bulkheads. Kinrathi tech shamans chanted in eerie harmony as they recalibrated the cruiser's weapon systems, coaxing additional power from the overworked reactors. The mood was electric, a mixture of anticipation and dread. They all knew the Ocampa were coming, and that the future of the cosmos would be decided in the coming battle. In a secure briefing room deep within the Indomitable, Admiral Hall gathered the leaders of the coalition forces. Holograms flickered to life around the table, displaying the grim visages of the Vorsath Primarch, the Clix Queen Mother, the Saurian Warlord, and a dozen other representatives of the allied species. "The Ocampa will be upon us within a matter of hours," Hall said, his voice grave. "Our long-range sensors have detected the energy signatures of at least 5 dreadnoughts, along with hundreds of support ships. It's the largest fleet they've ever assembled." The Saurian Warlord hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "Let them come, we will drown them in their own blood." The Clix Queen Mother chittered, her mandibles clacking. "We have a saying among my people. The swarm that fights together survives together. We will stand with you, Admiral." Hall nodded, his eyes hard. "We have a plan. It's risky, but it's our best chance. We'll use the dark energy torpedoes again, but this time we'll detonate them at a distance, creating a series of artificial singularities. The gravity wells should disrupt the Ocampa formation and force them to engage us piecemeal. We'll need all of your ships to hold the line and prevent them from flanking us." The Vorsath Primarch shimmered, his crystalline form refracting the light. "It will be done. Our ships will form a wall of steel around your flanks." As the discussion stretched long into the ship's artificial night, the coalition leaders poring over tactical displays and refining their strategy, a sudden commotion erupted outside the briefing room. The door hissed open and a young sensor officer burst in, his face pale. "Admiral, the Ocampa. They're here. They've just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. They're launching fighters and attack drones. It's a massive fleet, sir. Bigger than anything we've ever seen." Hall felt a cold knot form in his gut, but he pushed it aside. He had a job to do, and he would see it through to the end. "This is it, then," he said, his voice steady. "The final battle. The future of the galaxy will be decided here in the next few hours. I know I'm asking a lot of all of you. Many of us will not survive the day, but if we don't stop the Ocampa here, there won't be a galaxy left to fight for. So let's give them a fight they'll never forget. For our homes, for our families, for the future, let's send these bastards back to the hell they came from." A roar of approval filled the briefing room as the coalition leaders raised their voices in defiance. They knew the odds, knew the cost that would be paid, but they also knew that sometimes the only choice was to stand and fight, no matter the consequences. As Admiral Hall strode from the briefing room, his shoulders squared and his eyes alight with a fierce tenacity, he knew that whatever happened in the coming battle, the galaxy would never be the same. The Ocampa had started this war, but by all that was holy, the Coalition would finish it. In the war room of the Indomitable, Admiral Hall stared at the holographic display. His eyes narrowed. The combined Coalition fleet, a glittering array of ships from a dozen species, moved in formation to intercept the approaching Ocampa invasion force. The fate of the galactic realm hung in the balance. Suddenly, a comm officer's voice cut through the tense silence. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from deep within Ocampa space. It's on a secure channel, but I've never seen these encryption protocols before." Hall frowned. "Put it through." The hologram flickered, then coalesced into the image of an Ocampa male. But unlike the cruel, imperious overseers Hall had faced in the past, this one had a haunted, hunted look. His once resplendent uniform was tattered and stained, and a jagged scar ran down his right eye. "Admiral Hall," the Ocampa said, his voice rough, "I am the one they call the Liberator. I lead the resistance against the Overseer's tyranny." Hall leaned forward, his interest piqued despite his wariness. "I'm listening." "For too long my people have been shackled to the will of the Overseers, our lives spent in service to their insatiable hunger for conquest," the Liberator said. "But no more. We rebels have fought in the shadows for decades, striking where we can, but we have never had the strength to topple the regime. Until now." The hologram zoomed out, revealing a star map of Ocampa space. Red dots pulsed on key systems, shipyards, supply depots, command centers. "With the bulk of the Ocampa fleet engaged in your space, their defenses are stretched thin. We have an opportunity to strike at the heart of their power structure, to bring an end to this cycle of oppression and aggression once and for all." The Liberator's gaze bore into Hall's, fierce and desperate. "I offer you this intelligence, Admiral, the locations of their key facilities, the disposition of their forces, their battle plans, everything we have. In exchange, I ask only for your support in our uprising. Help us overthrow the Overseers, and I promise you the Ocampa that emerge will be a friend to your republic, not an enemy." Hall sat back, his mind racing. It could be a trap, a ploy to divide the Coalition forces, but if it was genuine... He turned to his intelligence officer. "Verify this information. If it checks out..." Hours later, Hall stood before the flickering holograms of the Coalition leaders, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. "The Liberator's intelligence is good," he said. "My experts have confirmed it. This is a chance we can't afford to pass up." There was a moment of heavy silence. Then, one by one, the leaders nodded their assent. "It's settled then," Hall said. "I'll dispatch a task force to link up with the rebels and coordinate our efforts. Meanwhile, the main fleet will continue to engage the Ocampa invasion force. We'll hit them on two fronts, from without and within." As the meeting adjourned and the holograms winked out, Hall turned to his comm officer. "Get me a channel to Major Khatri. Tell her to assemble her team. I have a mission for them." Deep within Ocampa space, the Rebel Alliance struck like lightning. Human and allied special forces, working in tandem with the Liberator's insurgents, launched daring raids on critical Ocampa installations. On the jungle world of Viridios, Major Amara Khatri led her team in a daring assault on a key munitions depot. As Ocampa guards fell to the flash and thunder of human weapons, Khatri and her demolitions expert rigged the facility's reactor to blow. They barely made it out before the entire depot vanished in a blinding fireball. In the shipyards of Calaxus Prime, rebel saboteurs infiltrated the orbital docks, planting explosives on half-completed warships and setting entire berths aflame. The night sky glowed orange as the Ocampa fleet's reinforcements burned. And on a dozen worlds, the Liberator's agents subverted Ocampa communication hubs, sowing disinformation and confusion among the enemy ranks. False orders were transmitted, supply chains disrupted, troop movements misdirected. the strategy began to pay dividends. Cut off from reliable resupply and reinforcement, the Ocampa invasion fleet started to lose ground against the determined coalition defense. Their attacks turned erratic, desperate, as the human and allied ships held the line with stubborn persistence. But the overseers were not so easily outfoxed. As reports of the rebel attacks filtered back to the Ocampa homeworld, the ruling council flew into a rage. They dispatched a sizable force of their most loyal and ruthless warriors to hunt down the Liberator and his collaborators. In the nebula, the Ocampa's Black Ops ships clashed with rebel and allied forces in a brutal shadow war, a desperate struggle fought in the darkness between the stars. And on the surface of a dozen contested worlds, the battle raged in neon-lit alleyways and across blasted wastelands as rebel and overseer forces clashed in a bitter struggle for the future of the Ocampa race. The future of the stars would be decided in the fire and fury of this desperate multi-front war, and Admiral Hall, standing on the bridge of the Indomitable as it traded fire with the Ocampa flagship, knew that failure was not an option. They had to hold the line. They had to win, no matter the cost, no matter the outcome. As the desperate struggle raged across the stars, a new hope emerged from an unexpected quarter. The Zeraxians, an enigmatic species renowned for their advanced technology and steadfast neutrality, broke their long isolation and joined the fray. Admiral Hall stood on the Indomitable's bridge, his eyes widening as a fleet of sleek, silvery ships dropped out of hyperspace alongside the battered coalition vessels. The Zeraxian crafts moved with an eerie grace, their hulls shimmering with an iridescent sheen that seemed to blur their outlines and confound the eye. The comm crackled to life, and a rich, mellifluous voice filled the bridge. "Greetings, Admiral Hall. I am High Chancellor Zorul of the Zeraxian Conclave. We come to lend our strength to your cause." Hall leaned forward, hardly daring to believe this sudden turn of fortune. "High Chancellor, your arrival is most welcome, but if I may ask, why now? The Zeraxians have always held themselves apart from the affairs of other species." Zorul's image appeared on the screen, his features an elegant blend of humanoid and avian characteristics. His eyes, deep and luminous, held a wisdom that seemed to span centuries. "We have watched the Ocampa's relentless expansion with growing concern," he said, his tone grave. "Their hunger for conquest knows no bounds. Left unchecked, they will consume the galaxy, and all will fall under their yoke. This we cannot allow." The High Chancellor paused, his gaze piercing even through the screen. "But it is not just our ships and weapons we bring to this fight. We offer you a tool that may turn the tide of this war, a cloaking technology that can render your vessels invisible to the enemy." Hall's mind raced with the possibilities. With such an advantage, they could strike at the heart of the Ocampa's power, catching them unawares. He met Zoral's eyes, a glimmer of hope kindling in his chest. "High Chancellor, your aid is most timely and appreciated. Together, we may yet bring an end to this conflict and secure a lasting peace." As the Zeraxian engineers worked to retrofit the coalition ships with the cloaking devices, Hall and his allies pored over the latest intelligence reports. The Ocampa homeworld, long the seat of their power, was heavily defended, its orbital stations and surface installations dripping with weapons. But with the Liberator's rebel forces fighting to seize control of key military facilities on the planet, a daring plan began to take shape. While the main coalition fleet continued to engage the Ocampa in a series of feints and holding actions, a smaller strike force equipped with the Zeraxian cloaking devices would penetrate deep into enemy space and launch a surprise attack on the homeworld. Their goal, to capture or eliminate the Overseers, the ruthless cabal that had driven the Ocampa's expansionist agenda for generations. With their leadership decapitated, the Ocampa war machine would be thrown into disarray, giving the coalition a chance to end the conflict once and for all. As the Indomitable and a contingent of Zeraxian ships slipped away from the main fleet, their hulls shimmering and fading from view as the cloaking devices engaged, Hall felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. This was a gamble, a last throw of the dice in a war that had already cost so much. But as he watched the stars blur into the swirling maelstrom of hyperspace, he knew there was no turning back. The destiny of the universe hung in the balance, and he would do whatever it took to see this through to the end. The strike force emerged from hyperspace on the fringes of the Ocampa home system, the cloaking fields, rendering them all but invisible against the starry backdrop. Hall leaned forward in his command chair, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "Admiral, we're receiving an urgent transmission from the surface," Lieutenant Chen reported, her fingers flying over the comm console. "It's the Liberator. His forces have seized control of the Central Fleet Command Hub, but they're under heavy attack from Loyalist troops. They need our support now, or they risk being overrun." Hall felt a moment of indecision, torn between the need to press the attack on the Overseers and the opportunity to aid the rebels in their crucial fight. The Liberator had risked everything to give them this chance. To abandon him now would be to squander a vital ally and a key foothold on the planet. He turned to his Xeraxian counterpart, High Commander Varix, who stood beside him on the bridge. "Commander, I intend to take the Indomitable and a portion of our force to support the rebels on the surface. Can I count on you to continue the mission to neutralize the Overseers?" Varix, his avian features inscrutable, nodded solemnly. "We will see it done, Admiral. The Ocampa leadership will fall this day, I swear it." With a heavy heart, Hall watched as the Xeraxian ships and the remainder of the strike force peeled away, their cloaked forms slipping silently toward the heart of the Ocampa defenses. Then, squaring his shoulders, he turned to his crew. "Helm, bring us into low orbit over the rebels' position. Tactical, I want a full spread of kinetic strikes on the Loyalist forces as soon as we're in range. It's time we even the odds down there." As the Indomitable dove towards the planet's surface, her hull glowing with the heat of re-entry, Hall could only hope that his decision would prove the right one. The destiny of the universe, and the hopes of all those who fought for freedom, hung in the balance. The Indomitable shuddered as another salvo of orbital fire hammered her shields. On the bridge, Admiral Hall gripped the arms of his command chair, his face grim. The viewscreen showed the rebel-held installation below, a sprawling complex of bunkers and gun emplacements. Now swarming with Ocampa Loyalist troops, explosions blossomed across the battleground as the opposing forces clashed. "Status report," Hall barked. "Shields at 30%, Lieutenant Chen replied, her hands flying over the damage control console. "Hull breaches on decks 5, 7, and 12. We can't take much more of this, sir." Hall nodded curtly. "Helm, bring us into low orbit. Tactical, target those orbital batteries and take them out. We need to give our ground forces some breathing room." The Indomitable's engines roared as the ship dived towards the planet's surface, her guns blazing. On the ground, Coalition Marines and Rebel fighters fought side by side, the air thick with the whine of energy weapons and the screams of the wounded. In the heart of the battle, the Liberator rallied his troops, his voice rising above the din. "Stand firm, my brothers and sisters. Today, we strike a blow for freedom that will echo across the stars." He led a charge against an Ocampa strongpoint, his blade flashing in the sun. Inspired by his bravery, the rebels surged forward, driving the Loyalists back. But the Ocampa were relentless. For every one that fell, two more seemed to take their place, pouring out from fortified bunkers and landing craft. The coalition forces fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. On the Indomitable's bridge, another explosion rocked the ship, throwing crew members from their stations. Smoke filled the air, and alarms blared. "Sir, we've lost main power," Chen shouted over the chaos. "Shields are gone, weapons offline, we're dead in the water." Hall's face hardened. He knew what he had to do. "All hands, this is the Admiral. Abandon ship. I repeat, all hands, abandon ship." As the crew rushed to the escape pods, Hall stayed at his post, overseeing the evacuation. The ship shook again, harder this time. A console exploded, showering the Admiral with sparks and shrapnel. He fell to the deck, blood pooling beneath him. "Admiral!" Commander Nora Sato, his first officer, was at his side in an instant. She heaved him to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder. "We need to go, sir. The ship is coming apart." Together they stumbled through the smoke and the flames, dodging falling debris and collapsing bulkheads. They reached the escape pods just as a final massive explosion tore through the Indomitable's core. Sato shoved Hall into a pod and slammed the hatch. The last thing the Admiral saw as the pod ejected was his ship, his home for so many years, breaking apart in a silent fireball. On the surface, the battle raged on. The Liberator and his forces fought with renewed fury, driving the Ocampa back inch by bloody inch. Finally, as the sun began to set, the Loyalists broke and ran, fleeing back to their ships. A cheer went up from the rebel lines. They had won. The installation was theirs. But even as the Liberator raised his fist in triumph, a deafening blast split the air. A brilliant flash of light consumed the command bunker, and a fireball rose into the sky like a miniature sun. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was gone, reduced to a crater of molten slag. The Liberator and everyone else inside had been vaporized in an instant. A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Then a cry of anguish rose from the rebel ranks, a howl of grief and rage that echoed across the scorched earth. In the days that followed, as news of the Liberator's death spread, the rebel coalition began to unravel. Without his charismatic leadership, old rivalries and resentments bubbled to the surface. One by one, the subjugated species began to pull back, retreating to their home systems to lick their wounds and brace for Ocampa retribution. The war ground on, a brutal, attritive slog that consumed lives and resources at a staggering rate. The Ocampa, sensing weakness, pressed their advantage, throwing more and more ships and soldiers into the fight. The coalition, exhausted and demoralized, could only cling on, trading space for time, hoping for a miracle that never came. In the end, after months of bitter fighting, the coalition leadership met in secret to discuss terms with the Ocampa overseers. The price of peace was a heavy one, a humiliating withdrawal, crippling reparations, a promise of non-interference in Ocampa affairs. But what choice did they have? To continue the war was to court annihilation, and so with heavy hearts they signed the accord, and the guns fell silent at last. On a hospital ship orbiting a shattered moon, Admiral Hall stared out of a viewport at the stars, his body healed but his spirit raw with loss. So many dead, so much destroyed, and for what? A return to the status quo, a tenuous, resentful peace that could shatter at any moment. He thought of the Liberator, of his courage and his vision snuffed out in an instant of fire. He thought of the brave men and women who had followed him, human and alien alike, now consigned to the void. Their sacrifices had bought the galaxy a reprieve, but at a terrible cost. The Ocampa still lurked in the shadows, licking their wounds, biding their time, and the scars of the war would linger long in the memories of those who had fought it. As Hall watched the stars wheel overhead, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the best they could hope for? A moment of peace in an endless cycle of war and revenge? Or was there a path to a better future, a way to break the wheel and build something lasting? He didn't know, but as he turned away from the viewport and limped back to his quarters, he made a silent vow. Whatever the future held, he would be ready for it. He would honor the memory of the fallen by continuing their fight, by working for a galaxy where their sacrifices would not have been in vain. It was a heavy burden, but one he was willing to bear for the sake of the living and in memory of the dead. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.